So welcome to the video sequence talking about the checkpoint concept. Checkpoints are a way of storing data about an interview session. Suppose that you're on page 3 of 5 and you're not ready to finish the interview. Well, if it's been correctly configured, you should be able to have an interview checkpoint saved and then retrieve it by resuming your interview session later on. What does that mean fundamentally in terms of Siebel? Well, it means that there must be two workflows, one for get checkpoint and one for set checkpoint. If we take a look at set checkpoint, for example, we'll see it's a very simple workflow, mostly concerned with creating a record in Siebel. The record will contain a base 64 encoded string, which represents all the data entered in the interview, and a bunch of other properties, for example, to identify the object ID or to give some sort of session identifier so that we can retrieve the data later on. The business component and the business object, but more specifically the business component and its underlying table, are our first preoccupation. If we look at this business component, which was imported when you imported the CIF from the zip file, when you click on the table which is listed here, it's highly probable in a new or a virtual environment that you're setting up that you don't get the response that you're expecting. Specifically, this table may not actually exist. In fact, if it's a new environment, it's a fairly high probability that it doesn't actually exist. So let's try and prove my point right now. See if we can find it. There we go. We're struggling for that. There's the business component. Here's the table. And let's go and query for the table. And the table is not present. That's because this table is actually not part of the zip file for the OPA 12 integration. This business components table actually comes from the OPA version 10 connector. So when you try clicking on the table, you'll get all sorts of error messages telling you that the object doesn't exist. So what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to install the connector for OPA 10 in order to install the metadata for that table. I'll be honest with you and say that if you install OPA 10, of course it can cohabit with an OPA 12 integration, there's no problem there, but you're probably going to end up installing a bunch of metadata and specifically a raft of tables that you may not actually need. So one technique that you could use is, and I'm not recommending this because it's not actually something I would imagine that Oracle would support, but if you download the OPA 10 connector, unzip it and go digging for the CIF files, which should show up in here somewhere. There's a PA release file somewhere. Oh, there it is. In the Siebel object subfolder, you could import one or both of these files, or indeed you could extract the metadata from that CIF and just import the table that you need rather than importing all of the metadata for a bunch of unneeded objects. That, however, is not something I'm going to show you because it's not something that you're supposed to do, but I'm sure you can understand what I mean. As you can see here, I've just opened the CIF file from the OPA 10 connector just to prove a point, is that that table does actually exist in the OPA 10 metadata. So I'll leave you to either import it or install the OPA 10 connector to ensure that you have it. So while that's happening, a quick note in respect of checkpoints. Although we are going to configure our connection that it supports checkpoints, the checkpoint usage is configured within the OPA project at the design of the screens. So in the slides, we've explained how you can use one of the sample projects called Energy Saver and how you can configure it to use your checkpoints. Because I haven't got time to show it in this particular video, and it's very simple to do, I put it in the slides. Anyhow, you now have compiled and delivered your metadata in respect of these new business object, business component, and table, and you have made sure that the workflows related to get and set checkpoint are published and activated. So what else needs to be done? Well, there is quite a little bit of work to be done, and probably a little bit of troubleshooting in respect of these two actions. Of course, the most fundamental thing at this stage is, as per usual, we need to go to our OPA generic connection and we need to add the two new service ports, one for set and one for get checkpoint. They're going to be using exactly the same style as all the others. So make sure you select the right web service and make sure also that you create the operations using the correct business services. It should be fairly straightforward because it's OPA get and OPA set checkpoint are the implementation names. Yeah, it helps if I use implementation name. Try again. Forgive me, it's getting late. So find your OPA get and set checkpoint in the service point using the implementation name, and make sure you change the binding as well as the address. Copy it from the previous one, make sure you copy the whole thing. Make sure the transport is correct, and then as per usual set up the operations. Make sure that for each of the operations, not only do you select the correct workflow process, which should be very obvious, but also don't forget to fill in the request filter and the request filter method, as well as the response filter and response filter method for each of them. Otherwise, as I explained earlier, you will end up getting extra XML tags in your output that will cause your basically your calls and responses to fail. So I've just done set and now done get, and now I'm doing set. Same deal, copying the URL, changing the binding, and making sure that when I go to the operation that I choose not only the operation but also the request and response filters, service and method, before I then clear cache. And I'm not going to regenerate the WSDL in this case, because the easiest way to test the get and set checkpoint is not actually in SOAP UI. It's to use, as I mentioned a moment ago, one of the sample OPA projects configured to use checkpoints, and then to use traditional logging, for example, of your EAI object manager and so forth, and of your workflow monitoring level. So I'm just about done for my get and set checkpoint. I'll clear the cache, make sure everything's okay. My gut feeling tells me there's going to be a little bit of debugging is necessary, even though these workflows are terribly simple. I would check the generate WSDL just to make sure there are no error messages, even though I don't intend to use it. So that looked okay. As I mentioned earlier, you can always use your EAI object manager logging to find out what's going on, because the vast majority of these workflows will manipulate using EAI object manager. So if you start seeing things like missing object or unknown element, it's probably a sign that your integration object or integration component hasn't been compiled. So unknown part is probably an integration object cache that hasn't been flushed, or an object that hasn't been compiled. So I'm going to do that now. I'll do that for all of the... you notice I'm using the deploy to runtime database to save time rather than go around and compile again. The project called Energy Saver will need to have been modified and deployed onto your same OPA server so that you can access it. Copy the URL to a file because you're going to need it again, and launch it by appending $ID followed by a random session identifier. You should then be able to use this project and navigate through the different pages. I'll try that again. So pick up a random identifier, launch the project, and you should be able to navigate to the next page, at which point it should start thinking about using the set checkpoint workflow. If you get an error at that point, I strongly recommend that you go back to the workflows and hunt for easily missed things, such as, for example, there are a number of places here where you have once again got file names because it's dumping things to a file. So check the business service steps that they are not dumping to a file. Edit the workflow, publish and reactivate it if necessary. Keep trying. And as you can see, there's an example of something I should have edited. There's a file path and folder path that I'll need to edit to republish and reactivate. And there's one on the get checkpoint workflow as well. Here it is. So be very careful about editing all of these because otherwise you'll get obviously errors when it tries to save the file. I also noticed in the supplied workflow that there was a default row ID value, which you probably just want to remove for the sake of sanity. Make sure you've published and activated all these new versions of your workflow. I think I mentioned earlier that I'm a bit of a paranoid person when it comes to publish and activate. I always like to publish in tools and then activate from the client. It's just what I like to do. And keep trying. If you reach the second screen and you've configured the Energy Saver to use checkpoints, it's a good sign. Now start entering some values and moving forward in the interview. And each time you click Next, it's good fun if you happen to have a database visualization tool to hand. Go and look at your Siebel database and focus on that table. The table that contains your base 64 encoded strings. Likewise, you can also go into your temp folder and check to see that the generated files are there for the set checkpoint request and response. But I'm just waiting for my MS SQL workbench to start up, and we'll go looking for the table and see what's in it. I repeat while I'm waiting is that this will only work if you followed the steps to configure the Energy Saver project to use checkpoints. And you'll find out about that in the slides because it's really very straightforward. So I'm going to go and find that table. Obviously, if you're using Oracle, you can go and find it in your own favorite tools. And I'm going to visualize the content. There should be one row in there. Here it comes. And there it is. You have the row ID which was created at such and such a time. And there's the decision text. There's the base 64 encoded data. If you want to return to that session later, use the resume session instead of start session in the URL. And you should find yourself back in the interview with the data that you previously entered. So these two URLs could be very useful, start session and resume session. I'm actually going to save them now so I don't forget them. So these are how from a URL you can call a new session and resume an existing session. That's it for now. Speak to you in the next video section.